Today, 16th June, I'm going to discuss in some detail the current diplomatic struggle between the Western powers and China and Russia, and I'm going to be looking at the peace conference, the so-called peace conference that's been taking place in Switzerland and which is due to end today. And I'm also going to look at the G7 summit statement and what it has to say about China, which to my mind is the most important development of the recent weeks, not just in terms of the global geopolitical conflict, but in terms of what it tells us about the situation in Ukraine. But before I discuss these two topics, I'm going to discuss the military situation, and I'm going to discuss it in a rather summary fashion because the war has now become so sprawling. There are so many Russian advances in so many places now that I'm finding it more and more difficult to keep on top of events, and I feared that if I were to spend my time discussing every Russian movement and advance and every Ukrainian counterattack, well, my programs would grow to an even more inordinate length than they already do. But briefly, let's first of all begin with the situation in Kharkiv region, where we've had many contradictory reports about the situation in Volchansk, but where we now have clarity. Now, to repeat again, about 2 days ago, stories started to spread, picked up, by the way, by various Russian telegram channels, or perhaps they're not really Russian telegram channels, some of them. Perhaps they've been set up by someone else, just saying. That kind of thing does happen in war, but definitely by some Russian telegram channels. Anyway, a story began to circulate that the Ukrainians carried out a counterattack in the Volchansk area and that Russian troops in Volchansk, in the aggregate plant, had been surrounded and been trapped by the Ukrainians there. Now, I've expressed skepticism about the story throughout. I pointed out that it's contrary to the trajectory of events. I've also pointed out in the past that the Ukrainians have made similar claims in the past, some of which were accepted by people both on the Russian side and, of course, in the West, and those claims of Ukrainian advances and successful Ukrainian counterattacks. Well, all of those claims, subsequently, it turned out, were wrong. So this is not so unusual. And, well, just to give a particular example, a particular case in point, something that happened almost exactly a year ago. I can't remember the exact date, but I can remember it very clearly. After the Ukrainians started a counteroffensive in the Bakhmut area shortly after the Russian capture of Bakhmut itself, the Ukrainians claimed that they had advanced on the northern flanks of Bakhmut and captured an important village called Berkhovka. And I remember the General Syrski, who was at that time commanding Ukrainian troops in the Bakhmut area, was saying that his forces had taken fire control over Bakhmut and that the Russian troops in Bakhmut were operationally surrounded. And I can remember there were a lot of alarmist reports within the Russian telegram channels at the time, echoing this information. And no less a person than Yevgeny Prigozhin, who was at that time still alive and in charge of the Wagner organization. He too came forward and said that Berkhovka had indeed been recaptured by the Ukrainians. Except it was completely untrue. There was no reality to it. The Russian Defense Ministry issued statements contradicting it, and over the couple of days that followed, it became clear that the Ukrainian military had indeed made attacks towards Berkhovka and had indeed captured some ground in that area. The village itself remained, and by the way, continued to be thereafter, firmly under Russian control. So I was skeptical about this story because it seemed to me too much, this story about Russians being encircled in Volchansk, because it seemed to me so close to these previous reports of Ukrainian advances and Ukrainian encirclements of Russian troops, which have repeatedly proved to be wrong. And, well, let's see what the actual situation is. Now, yesterday, late in the evening, Group of Forces North published their summary of the military situation, and they went out of the way to deny these rumours, these claims. They said this: on June 15th, Group of Forces North continued their liberation of the border areas of Kharkiv region. In the Volchansk direction, fierce fighting continues in Volchansk. The enemy counterattacked and tried to transfer reinforcements across the Volcha River, but did not succeed. By evening, the intensity of these attacks decreased due to heavy losses. Over the past 24 hours in Volchansk, the enemy lost more than 60 men. On the territory of the aggregate plant, there is still fighting with Group of Forces North advancing. The supply routes for our assault troops are operating uninterrupted. And then Group of Forces North went on to say this: against the background of the beginning of the so-called peace summit in Switzerland, and in the absence of real successes of the Ukrainian armed forces on the battlefield, propagandists of the Kiev regime are inventing virtual victories, namely videos of fighting in the vicinity of the village of Glubokoye, reports about the alleged encirclement of the aggregate plant, and others. In reality, what is happening is what already happened a year ago. The commander of the 36th Army Brigade, that's to say the Ukrainian 36th Army Brigade, one of the Marine brigades as I understand it, is thrown to the slaughter. Territorial defence units assigned to the brigade, and near Lipsy, three battalions of the 13th Brigade of the National Guard are preparing to withdraw to make up for losses. Group of Forces North stand to the death and do not give the enemy a single chance to succeed. Victory will be ours. Now, if we put aside the, shall we say, somewhat blustering language, which is not untypical, by the way, of Russian military rhetoric, it's pretty clear what the Russians are saying. They're saying they're continuing to advance on the territory of the aggregate plant. The supply lines to their assault forces are secure. There is no truth to the claim that Russian troops in the aggregate plant have been encircled, and the Ukrainians are making the whole thing up. Now, over the course of the last 24 hours, we have had video confirmation of all of this. And interestingly, the video confirmation has come from the Ukrainians themselves. They show territory between the main Russian positions and the aggregate plant under Russian control. And they show Ukrainian forces trying to shell this territory, this belt of territory, and indeed Russian positions in the aggregate plant itself. And one film shows a large explosion in a particular building in the aggregate plant, which it's been widely assumed is the result of a guided bomb. And the assumption is that the Ukrainians have used what's left of their air force, their small number of MiG-29 fighter jets that still survive, to drop at long range American guided bombs on this building where the Russian troops are believed to be located. So clearly there is an intense battle going on, but the overall account that we've had from Group of Forces North is true. Now, I have encountered this so many times over the course of this conflict. Claims coming from Ukraine of dramatic advances and of encirclements of Russian troops, which turn out to be wrong. Now, that, of course, does not mean that the Russians themselves do not come up with all kinds of fantastic stories and do not engage in wishful thinking. Though, in general, the Defense Ministry, the Russian Defense Ministry, and the Russian military itself is extremely careful to be accurate in what it says. But as I've discovered many times, Russian telegram channels, Russian bloggers, Russian commentators often get far ahead of actual events, and it's not always possible to be sure that what they say is really so. It's also the case, by the way, that in the case of a few Russian bloggers, they seem to have a strong tendency to catastrophize and to assume that the worst has happened, and when reports of the worst start to appear, they rush off to reproduce it and to give the appearance of believing that it is true. But anyway, a propaganda initiative, a rather clever and well-executed one from the Ukrainian side, and let me reiterate again a point I have made many times. Propaganda has an important role to play in war, and one should not be critical of the fact that the Ukrainians have been able to spin a story like this and keep it alive for something like 36 hours. But basically, a piece of propaganda spin, a fictional victory, but one that has no substance behind it. Now, the fighting in Volchansk continues. The Russians are making gradual progress through the aggregate plant, which it's clear the Ukrainians are defending intensely. The Ukrainians, as the Russians say, are trying to keep their forces north of the Volcha River resupplied and are finding it all but impossible to do so because the Russians are able to destroy the crossing points. And we see that the Ukrainians have attempted what I suspect is another desperate throw. They've committed some of their few remaining aircraft to the battle to launch airstrikes on the advancing Russian troops in an area where the Russians have almost total air dominance and where it is likely, once the Russians recognize what is happening, as they will have done by now, that the Russians will act quickly to secure the air and to prevent airstrikes like this taking place again. So, anyway, that's the situation in Volchansk. Now, if Ukrainian counterattacks in Volchansk seem to be more imaginary than real, Ukrainian counterattacks in the Glubokoye area in Lipsy appear to be very real, and we learned that This is again from Group of Forces North in the Lipsy direction. The enemy, that's to say the Ukrainians, in small groups are trying to counterattack. During the day, we repelled 2 counterattacks and killed up to 14 men from the 13th Brigade of the Ukrainian National Guard. And this morning, there are reports that the Ukrainians have intensified their counterattacks near Lipsy towards Glubokoye, and that as many as 3 battalions are involved, which would be a force of around 1,500 men, though the Russians are apparently bombing and shelling this rather powerful attack, and we'll just have to wait and see what, if anything, it achieves. But anyway, that's what I wanted to say about the situation in Kharkiv region. Everywhere else, as has been true now for many weeks, for months in fact, since the collapse of Ukraine's summer offensive in the autumn of 2023. Everywhere else, the Russians continue to push forward. And, well, we get less news from Chasiv Yar recently, except that the Ukrainians have now finally acknowledged significant Russian advances on Chasiv Yar's northern flank. I've no doubt that these advances took place a long time ago, and that the territory that the Ukrainians now concede the Russians control, the Russians have in reality controlled for a long time. But anyway, that's one piece of news we've received from the Chasiv Yar area. There are lots of reports that the Russians are gradually closing in on Siversk, and that they're making more advances there, particularly in the village of Razdolovka, but in other places too. There are reports that the Russians have captured another village in the Zaporozhye area, in the area presumably north of Rabotino. This place in the Rabotino-Verbovoye area, Rabotino, this tiny village, which has now fallen again under Russian control. I'm not going to pretend that I really know exactly where this place, which the Russians say they have captured, is located, or that I really understand the significance of the Russian advances in this area either. But anyway, the reports are that the Russians are gradually pushing forward there too, and the Russians apparently having established control of the village of Georgievka, west of Marinka. Reports are now saying, some reports are claiming, that they have entered the village of Maximilianovka, immediately to the west of Georgievka. And it's important to say that if they do capture this village, this next village, Maximilianovka, then that will put the Russians just a few kilometers east of Kurakhovo, the main logistical hub of the Ukrainian army in southern Donbass, the place from which places like Vuhledar to the south is supplied. In fact, if Maximilianovka falls, Kurakhovo itself will be within easy artillery range of the Russian military. So just saying. And perhaps the most important Russian advances, in fact, I've no doubt that the most important Russian advances continue to be in the Avdiivka or Cheretino area. The Russians are said to have consolidated control of Novo-Alexandrovka. There is still some uncertainty about whether they control every single building in Novo-Alexandrovka, or whether the Ukrainians might still have a presence in the village. But if they do, it's likely to be a small one. And the Russians supposedly have not only captured Sokol, but are moving to the other villages in this area, to the west, villages like villages. Oh goodness. To the other villages in this area, which apparently they need to control in order to secure their positions in this area. Villages like Yevgenivka and others. So, sorry, I can't always keep up with the names of all of these villages, but Novopokrovskaya, I think, is one of them. Anyway, the Russians are clearing, apparently, these villages, and the Ukrainians are pulling back. Now, in Bild Zeitung, the German reporter Julian Röpke, who is, as I've said many times, an enthusiastic supporter of Ukraine, but also, it must be said, an increasingly angry and concerned one, is saying that the Russians, because of the advances that they have successfully made to places like Novo-Alexandrovka, that they're now just 7 kilometers from the road, that the main supply road to the Ukrainian grouping in Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka, this road which goes from Pokrovsk to the west. The Russians have almost reached this road, and if the Russians capture another village called Vozvizhenka, which lies to the north of Novo-Alexandrovka, they will have in effect cut the road, because they will be so close to the road that it will be all but impossible for Ukrainian forces to continue to keep their troops in Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka further east supplied. Now, I'm going to add my own qualifier to this. I don't know very much about the way in which the road or railway system in Donbass works, but I'm going to say this: even if the Russians do capture or do cut this road from Pokrovsk to Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka, I think it is expecting too much that this is going to cut off supplies to the Ukrainian forces in Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka. I am sure that there are other roads through which the Ukrainians can reroute their supplies. I'm sure that they can do it from Kramatorsk, for example. It will complicate Ukrainian supply routes, but it will not break them. And I think that for the Russians to cut the supply lines completely to Chasov Yar and Konstantinovka, they would first of all have to bring these towns in effect into a kind of semicircle in ways that cut the access roads much closer to these towns than by doing it in places so far away from these towns. But the thing is that roads and railway links don't just work for the Ukrainians. Potentially, they can start to work for the Russians as well. And it's clear that the Russians have been working very intensively over the last year or so to sort out their own logistical links in Donbass. So, for example, we're getting reports that the Russians have now almost completed a major railway project that links up Rostov, which is of course located in Russia itself, goes through central and southern Donbass, links up ultimately with the other railway line that the Russians have been building through the land bridge to Crimea. Anyway, the construction of these railway routes by the Russians, which are now almost complete, it is said will drastically simplify Russian logistics in the conflict area in Ukraine. And as I have discussed, and just many others have discussed as well, One of the reasons why Avdiivka and, by the way, Bakhmut and Chasiv Yar are important as well is because they also lie close to railway lines and or astride railway and road lines. And Ukrainian control of these towns has also impacted on Russian logistics. The same, by the way, is true of Vuhledar in the south of Donetsk. Vuhledar is very close to a major railway that passes through the south, and which I think the Russians would be very keen to use, but which they have not been able to use because it is within relatively easy shelling distance of Vuhledar. So the Russians cutting Ukrainian supply lines will, of course, complicate life for the Ukrainians, but the Russians capturing railway lines and roadways and building their own railway lines, which obviously will follow a different pattern from the existing railway lines, which were created by the Soviet Union at a time when the Soviets did not imagine that Ukraine and Russia would ever be in conflict with each other. Anyway, doing all of this is going to significantly change the logistical picture in Donbass. Now, this is something which, again, very few people, I think, understand or reckon sufficiently on. Because there's a lot of discussion about why the Russian army is taking its time to advance through Donbass. And I've explained many times that the size of the forces, the density of Ukrainian defences, the fact that many of these defence lines have been under construction since 2014, all of that has played a significant role. And of course the build-up of the Russian army, its development since the start of the special military operation, has also played a role. The Russians had far smaller forces at the outset of the current conflict than they do now, simply because the number of forces available to them were significantly less than they are now. But another factor in slowing this operation has undoubtedly been logistics. Keeping large numbers of men and machines supplied, enabling them to keep moving forward, must require huge quantities of ammunition, fuel, every other supply, shells, ammunition, every other form of supply that you can think of, medical equipment, you name it. And inevitably, the further the Russians advance, the more difficult it is going to be to keep the Russians' troops in the advance, at the cutting edge, to keep them equipped. And that in itself, going beyond any question of Ukrainian resistance, surely is going to affect tempos. Now, I say that, I mean, I'm now talking entirely from my own background. Again, in part of my life, I was to some extent involved in what was called civilian logistics, moving freight and trucks and that kind of thing around. And, well, I know a little bit about this sort of thing. I cannot imagine that it is that different in war. And it is something which I think that far too few people reckon on. So yes, cutting the road from Pokrovsk to Chasiv Yar is going to make life a bit more complicated and difficult for the Ukrainians in Konstantinovka and Chasiv Yar. It is not going to have the decisive outcome, I think, that some people think, because the Ukrainians are going to be able to reroute most of these supplies to get to their advanced troops through other routes, probably passing through Kramatorsk. But the further the Russians can push the Ukrainians back, and the more of the road and rail system they're able to bring under their own control, and the more railways, networks and things that they can construct, well, the stronger their position becomes. It is as important, I suspect, as the overall build-up of forces in and of itself actually is. Now, saying all of this, we've had other pieces of news from the battlefronts, not always easy to understand. I discussed about a week ago, the fact that it seemed to me likely, quite possible, that the Russians would respond to the decision by the Western powers to allow cross-border missile and rocket strikes in the Kharkiv area by interfering with American drones over the Black Sea. There were some suggestions last week that something like that might have happened. This was provoked by the fact that a number of American drones switched off their transponders and went circling in the area in all sorts of unexplained and strange ways. Well, something else happened apparently over the last 24 hours, which also might suggest that the Russians are now starting to interfere systematically with American drones. And that is that an American Triton drone, one of these very big American jet-powered surveillance drones like the Global Hawk, which took off from an airbase in Italy, apparently over the Black Sea, suddenly started to emit signals that it was in difficulty. And apparently it then changed course and flew back to its base. Now, some are speculating that this again might have been the result of Russian interference with this drone, electronic warfare, jamming of this drone. Perhaps it was. We don't know. And of course the Russians aren't saying, and the Americans aren't saying. I don't think that this incident and the previous incident in themselves tell us enough for us to be able to say that the Russians are now jamming Western drones and aircraft over the Black Sea. But it might point in that direction. If there are many more incidents of this kind, if a pattern starts to develop, and it will probably take a few weeks before we can say definitely that it has, well, then we can perhaps start to draw certain conclusions. This incident is interesting, but for the moment it is no more than that. We need to file it away and remember it and keep track of what is going on over the Black Sea. Budanov, Ukraine's intelligence chief, for his part, has also been talking about the situation in the Black Sea and in the Crimea area. He says that the Russians have now deployed their S-500 anti-missile and aircraft system to Crimea. This is an extremely modern, state-of-the-art system that has only recently entered service. It's another big upgrade, apparently, over the S-400 system. Perhaps it's intended to counter ATACMS missile strikes on Crimea, which, by the way, seem to have faded away a bit over the last few weeks. Again, I'm not sure that this is correct. It's what Budanov is telling us. One would assume that since he is head of Ukraine's military intelligence, he would know, but I don't think he is, on these questions, necessarily the most reliable source. But anyway, let's just perhaps go a bit beyond what the facts tell us and make a few assumptions. We assume that the Russians are jamming the drones, the American drones and the Western drones, and the American aircraft over the Black Sea and the NATO aircraft over the Black Sea, and that they are deploying their S-500 systems to Crimea. Well, I suspect that taken together, that will change the balance, shift the balance further in Russian favour in the war in the air over the Black Sea. Just saying. Anyway, this is where I'm going to finish my discussion today about the military situation. The Russians continued their advances westwards. The Ukrainians still continue to absorb heavy losses. Ukrainian claims to have encircled a Russian force in Volchansk are, I think, conclusively proved now to have been untrue. But the Ukrainians, having so far failed in Volchansk, which, to be clear, they are now clearly in danger of losing, the Ukrainians appear to have refocused again on Lipsy and are mounting a major attack on that village, even as I'm making this program. Let's turn to the diplomatic situation. And I'm going to start with what I think is the less important event, which is the summit in Lucerne. We're going to get a statement later this afternoon. At least that's what we've been promised. It's not clear how many countries have attended. I've seen a guesstimate by someone say that it's 85, which doesn't seem that impressive if I have to be honest. But let's wait and see. It's clear that in some cases, some countries have attended with considerable misgivings. Two countries in particular, Turkey and Saudi Arabia, sent their foreign ministers. In the case of Turkey, they were apparently, it's part of, as I said, Erdogan's long game, which he endlessly plays, of appearing to be on both sides at the same time. With the Russians, he's their dear friend, their strategic partner. With the Ukrainians, he is a loyal member of the NATO alliance, even as he is apparently applying on behalf of Turkey to join the BRICS. So it's not surprising that the Turkish foreign minister was there. The other foreign minister who attended was the Saudi foreign minister. MBS himself apparently declined to go. There's been a major effort made by the Western powers and by Zelensky himself to try to get the Saudis to go to the summit in Lucerne. Apparently, the Saudis were very unwilling to go and had initially indicated that they would not go. But Zelensky visited Saudi Arabia. I believe he went there twice. So you can sense how important it was for him to get at least a representative from Saudi Arabia to go. Anyway, one way or the other, the Saudis, who have no interest in destroying their relationship with the United States and who do not conduct their foreign policy that kind of way anyway, they sent their foreign minister too. I'm not sure what the organisers of this conference in Lucerne thought they would achieve by getting these two foreign ministers, the ones from Turkey and Saudi Arabia, to turn up, because both of them delivered speeches at the conference, which essentially said the same thing, which is that the conference made absolutely no sense in the absence of the Russians. I'm putting it rather more pithily than the two foreign ministers themselves did, but so it seems to me that the Turks and the Saudis both said that if you want to negotiate an end to the war, you have to speak, you have to have negotiations between both sides. You can't just refuse to speak to the Russians and present them with, in effect, an ultimatum or a demand and expect that the Russians will just accept it and do what you want. So, a discordant voice from the Turks and the Saudis pointing out the underlying flaw and problem with this conference. In all other respects, I've been listening to the various statements that the various representatives of the Western powers made at this conference. The Czechs, the Germans, Scholz was there, Justin Trudeau was there, Kamala Harris was there, Macron was there. And I think the thing that immediately struck me is that they were all saying essentially the same thing. In fact, to the point where even some of the turns of phrase seemed identical. They said, for example, that this is a war of aggression, that Russia is the aggressor, that Ukraine is the victim, that one can't put the victim at the same level as the aggressor. This is, of course, a talking point. It might be true in some wars. It's debatable whether it's true of this one, but it's a talking point again, not actually a policy, as the Saudis and the Turks were trying to point out. But anyway, there was this, these statements, as I said, very, very similar, coming from Western officials. Most probably they were copying each other, but I have to say the similarity in some of the speeches, in some of the turns of phrase, was so great that I did wonder at times whether they might not all be employing the same script writer. Just saying. Anyway, the long of the short of it was, I didn't get the sense that anything real came out of this conference at all. Apparently, the statement that's going to be published is going to contain the ritual words about reaffirming Ukraine's independence and territorial integrity and that sort of thing. And apparently there's some attempt to try to bring up the question of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant. It will be interesting to see whether all the countries present at the conference decide to sign off on a communique that says something like that. But I can't say fundamentally that this summit conference changes anything substantial. Now, there's been a cascade of statements from Western officials and Western commentators that are saying that the real negotiations are not going to happen at this conference. Well, obviously not. But that they're going to happen at some point in the autumn. In other words, after, presumably, the November elections. That leaves unexplained what it is exactly that Western officials believe is going to change between now and late autumn that will put Ukraine in a better position to negotiate with the Russians than the one it is in now. Perhaps they really do believe that the F-16s are going to change the situation on the battlefronts. Brian Beletic at the New Atlas has a video which I believe is on this topic, though I confess I haven't watched it, but it's one that I think most certainly will cast light on the possibilities of that. I don't think, I'm going to say, anticipating anything that Brian might say, I don't think that the F-16s are going to help materially the situation for Ukraine on the battlefronts at all. That's my own view. Perhaps there's some expectations that something else might change or break in some way. There's a lot of speculation, there's still some speculation about China, for example. A important member of the North American Ukrainian community, I believe he's American, Alexander Motyl, has written a long piece for The Hill in which he speculates that China will eventually tire of its support for Russia in Ukraine, will decide that this is not in Chinese interests, and will force the Russians to sue for peace. I believe that is a complete fantasy, but perhaps some Westerners believe that. Or maybe there is some hope that out of this Swiss conference some kind of diplomatic momentum might be generated, which will finally lead to pressure being put on the Russians. Again, I have to say, I don't believe that this is so. On the contrary, there's an important meeting of the BRICS coming up in September. There's a long list of countries, which include countries like Thailand and Indonesia and others, which apparently want to join the BRICS. I would have thought that the diplomatic momentum will be on the side of the Russians and the Chinese and the others, not in the autumn, not with the Western powers or with this process. Or maybe they're just saying to each other that it's in the autumn that things will change because, well, that's another way of kicking the can down the road. What I will say is this. Yesterday I made the point in my programme, it's been picked up, by the way, I noticed by several others, that, my words have been picked up, I noticed by several others, that, in my opinion, Putin's offer is Ukraine's last chance. Russian officials have made that clear, that if Ukraine does not accept the offer that Putin made 2 days ago for a peace based on the principles of Istanbul Plus, then the Russians will press on for total victory. We had more comments to this effect from Russian officials over the course of the last 24 hours. A prominent member of the Duma, Mr. Tolstoy, he is, I believe, a member of the famous Tolstoy family, which produced Lev Tolstoy, the great novelist, and Peter Tolstoy, who was, by the way, another important Russian novelist. But anyway, never mind. Anyway, that Tolstoy has also said that Putin's offer is Ukraine's final chance. Most interestingly, Viktor Medvedchuk, who until the start of the special military operation, in fact, some time before the start of the special military operation, in up to 2022, maybe 2021, 2022, was the most important opposition politician in Ukraine. Anyway, Viktor Medvedchuk has now come forward and is saying the same thing. I will quote his words. "The new peace initiative of Vladimir Putin is the last chance to preserve the Ukrainian state. Ukraine at present, with its illegitimate president, the regime adversary to the people, legal nihilism, and the state ideology of the 1930s. He uses a stronger word, a simpler word to describe it, but again, I'm going to be sensitive to the platform, cannot be considered to be the state anymore. Vladimir Putin suggests returning the state to Ukrainians, making it neutral, sovereign, demilitarized, and denazified. The peace progress returns not only the peace to Ukraine, but also rights of Ukrainian citizens, criminally overturned by the regime of Zelensky. Ukraine at present cannot exist without huge external borrowings. This is actually a bankrupt country, a black hole for the Western economy, a concentration camp for the Ukrainian people, with everyone wanting to flee except the gang that is criminally reigning. Well, Medvedchuk is being very, very harsh about Zelensky, but given the fact that he was arrested and detained and apparently roughed up before he was exchanged with the Russians for various prisoners in Russian control. Well, Medvedchuk can perhaps be forgiven for thinking so harshly of Zelensky, but the key point is that he says that this is Ukraine's last chance. And I think it is. I also think that a couple of days ago, before he made this statement to the Russian Foreign Ministry Board, the one where he outlined his peace proposals, Putin also met with his top military leaders. The Kremlin has confirmed that the meeting took place, but has provided us with no transcript of what was said. It seems to me that this was clearly a council of war, and that the conjunction between that meeting with the military leaders and the meeting in the foreign ministry and the peace offer, that's a more important conjunction than the one that some people are making between Putin's peace offer and the conference in Switzerland. I suspect that what happened over the course of that meeting is that the military leaders briefed Putin about the military situation, the fact that the Ukrainian army is withering away, informed him of their plans for an offensive, and that this was what then gave Putin the green light to go forward and to make his offer, his public offer at the subsequent meeting of the Foreign Ministry Board. In other words, Putin made this final offer because his military are briefing him that the war is not only going Russia's way, but that the conditions are now being created for Russia's victory, and that they have plans which they're likely to enact at some point in the next few months that will bring that victory closer and perhaps even to fruition. Now that, of course, reinforces the point that this is Putin's last offer to Ukraine, and that if Ukraine doesn't accept it, as Medvedchuk says, it will be the end of the Ukrainian state. Well, that's my inference from what we have seen, but it makes much more sense than imagining, as some Western leaders and commentators appear to do, that things will continue pretty much as they are for the next couple of weeks and months, and then sometime in the autumn some kind of negotiations can begin once the November elections are out of the way, presumably for some kind of freezing of the conflict or something of that kind. Now, this now brings me to the other big question, which is the one that I touched on in speaking about the article in The Hill by Alexander Martil. Now, I believe Alexander Martil is fairly well informed about thinking in Washington. I don't pretend to know much about him. I mean, I've seen that he's been around for a long time. I've been reading his articles off and on for, well, certainly roughly a decade, I would guess. I've always found him extremely hostile to Russia, to President Putin, to any relationship between Russia and Ukraine, and he has been continuously hostile to any Ukrainian politician, such as former President Yanukovych, who he has thought of as in any conceivable way pro-Russian or even neutral. So that gives us the kind of background to his views. And anyway, my own guess is that Martil, in speaking in this way, is reasonably well informed, perhaps very well informed, about overall thinking amongst the the foreign policy elite in Washington. And in his article in The Hill, he puts together a very interesting, but in my opinion completely bizarre and entirely wrong thesis. He says that Russia is a colony of China, but a colony that also wants to be an empire. And on the one hand, the Russians are now totally dependent on the Chinese. Their economy presumably would collapse completely without Chinese support. So the Russians are totally dependent on the Chinese. They can only conduct the war with Chinese support and permission. But even as they're a colony of China's, they have the completely contradictory and indeed delusional aspiration to re-establish themselves as a great empire again. Now, this thesis, this argument that Martil makes, is of course unsupported by any information. There isn't, I think, a single quotation from Putin or any one of his officials. There's no analysis of the actual situation on the battlefronts, of the economic realities, of the balance of trade between China and Russia, no real discussion of the BRICS, none of these things that you would expect to see if this was actually a real piece of analysis. But I think that it does reflect what I suspect is a very common view within the political establishment in Washington. And Martil goes on to say, based on his premise, which, as I said, is an unsupported premise, unsupported by any actual discussion of facts, he goes on to say that sooner or later, when it begins to become clear to China that Russia cannot win in Ukraine, the Chinese will become tired of the whole affair and they will rein the Russians in. Why they would want to do that, why the Chinese would want to rein the Russians in if, as Martil believes, they have instead given the Russians the green light to start the war in Ukraine, why the Chinese would not, on the contrary, help the Russians, in that case, to win in Ukraine, well, that he doesn't really explain either. But I think that this is very much, again, consistent with Western thinking, that the key to the problem, the way to win this war against Russia in Ukraine, ultimately is through China. This, even as the West continues to work up towards an ultimate conflict with China over Taiwan, the South China Sea, or everything else. Well, you can see this in the statement of the G7, which came out the day before the start of the conference in Switzerland, because the G7 statement obviously makes the usual declarations of support for Russia, but then it proceeds to discuss China in this way. We will continue taking measures against actors in China and third countries that materially support Russia's war machine, including financial institutions, consistent with our legal systems, and other entities in China that facilitate Russia's acquisition of items for its defense industrial base. We reiterate, in this context, we reiterate that entities, including financial institutions, that facilitate Russia's acquisition of items or equipment for its defense industrial base are supporting actions that undermine the territorial integrity, sovereignty, and independence of Ukraine. Accordingly, we will impose restrictive measures consistent with our legal systems to prevent abuse and restrict access to our financial systems for targeted individuals and entities in third countries, including Chinese entities that engage in this activity. We will take robust action against actors who aid Russia in circumventing our sanctions, including by imposing severe costs on all those who fail to immediately cease providing material support to Russia's aggression, and by strengthening domestic enforcement and stepping up our business engagement to promote corporate responsibility. We call on financial institutions to refrain from supporting and profiting from Russia's war machine. We will take further steps to deter and disrupt this behaviour. Notice the harping on China here. There's China's financial institutions, China's industries. It's these, obviously, that they have in mind. Now, I've previously made the point that the sanctions that the United States previously imposed on Russia, the last sanctions that the United States imposed on Russia, are really the extension of Russian sanctions to include China and its financial system. China, we're told, is supporting the Russian war economy, except, of course, that the US Treasury now claims that Russia's entire economy is a war economy, something, of course, for which no evidence is provided and which makes absolutely no sense at all. Just saying. But the United States has given itself powers to enforce secondary sanctions against third countries, and that means that it can impose sanctions against Chinese industrial groups and financial institutions that they say are facilitating the Russian war machine. And this can be done, by the way, since these would be secondary sanctions, without, I think, the need for a separate executive order from the president himself. The United States is now going to be, or rather the Treasury Department, has the power, using secondary sanctions, to impose basically across-the-board sanctions on China's entire financial and banking sector. And I think perhaps this is what we're now going to see start to evolve over the next few weeks and months, and perhaps it is what is making the Western powers believe that sometime in the autumn the Russians will begin to come to terms. The idea seems to be that the West will start to impose sanctions on Chinese banks and on financial institutions. The Chinese will panic. They'll tell the Russians, stop what you're doing in Ukraine. The Russians supposedly will at that point stop what they are doing in Ukraine. The Russians will thereby be, in effect, defeated in Ukraine. But of course, those sanctions against the Chinese financial institutions won't really be lifted at all, because the West, the United States, of course, is determined ultimately to go against China. Promises will no doubt be made to lift the secondary sanctions, but as night follows day, the sanctions against Russia will remain in place, and they will remain in place indefinitely. And the secondary sanctions against China will do as well. And then at some point next year, the neocons in Washington will be able to pull out the corks from their champagne bottles and will celebrate the famous victory that they think they are on the brink of achieving. I think this is a completely delusional plan. I think the Chinese have seen through this perfectly well. I think the Chinese know perfectly well that a sanctions war against them is coming. I think that is not going to cause them to change their policy with respect to Russia, or going to make them start distancing themselves from Russia. I think it's going to cause the Chinese to intensify their own financial and other payment mechanisms, to lend more support to BRICS expansion, to prepare for the storm that I think that they can certainly see is coming. And besides, I think that the level of influence that China wields over Russia on this question is completely misunderstood in the West, and is based on a misjudgment, a complete misjudgment of the importance of these countries to the other. So we are heading towards a sanctions war against China as well. If you look at the G7 statement, it's clearly set out there. And of course, the ultimate irony of all of this is that just as the Europeans have been strong-armed or bulldozed by the Americans into giving Ukraine a $50 billion loan secured against income from Russian assets, but ultimately backstopped by the European Union, a backstop which sooner or later is going to have to come into play because a Ukrainian default is inevitable. Well, the interest is nowhere near enough to satisfy the bondholders for this loan. Well, just as the Europeans have gone along with that, so they have in effect endorsed the imposition, the American imposition of secondary sanctions against China, which are completely in conflict with the interests of Europe's, and specifically Germany's, economy. Because of the way it's been done, because of the fact that these sanctions that the Americans are going to start imposing are secondary sanctions, I don't think the Europeans are in a position any longer, having basically now sold the pass, to object or to slow this process down. It's astonishing to see how all of this is playing out. I think European leaders, the current crop of European leaders who have been living in a fantasy world for a very long time, one I suspect ultimately formed at the end and beginning of the Cold War, one which assumes unlimited American power and predominance, simply do not grasp the extent to which the world, in fact, has changed, and the long-term damage to Europe, the continent which they claim to lead, that they are in effect doing. Well, there we are. That's where we stand. That is the direction of events. Now, I'm going to finish this program by making one last point, which is one which illustrates, to my mind, the extent to which the European leaders have made themselves, are in fact, voluntary suckers, if you like, for a neocon project ultimately made in Washington. Today, there is this extraordinary article in the Financial Times. The title reads as follows: Russia overtook US as gas supplier to Europe in May. Rise in market share highlights difficulty of weaning the region off Russian energy. And then we go on to read, Europe's gas imports from Russia overtook supplies from the United States for the first time in almost 2 years in May, despite the region's efforts to wean itself off Russian fossil fuels since the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And then the article goes on to explain that there are various one-off factors. The fact that there's repairs being done in the United States to a major provider, the fact that there's problems with shipping, all those sort of things. Why those sort of things should not recur again is, of course, another question. But anyway, this is there. There are various one-off factors overall, or so we're told. But ultimately, it is the Russians who, again, have just squeaked ahead of the Americans. And of course, the Financial Times also provides us with a graph. And that graph shows that for the last couple of months, supplies of liquefied natural gas from the United States to Europe are falling, and that supplies of Russian gas, both pipeline gas through Ukraine, but also, by the way, and increasingly through Turkey, and liquefied natural gas, presumably from the Arctic, that those supplies have been gradually ticking up again. Now, I absolutely buy into the one-off factors. More likely than not, we're going to see American supplies grow and Russian supplies fall off again. At some point in the next few weeks, America will again overtake Russia as Europe's as one of Europe's big three gas suppliers. The biggest at the moment, by the way, is Norway. Just saying. Anyway, no doubt that is true. But again, this fact, what happened in May, highlights the ultimate reality. The reality that European leaders simply do not want to face. This is that it makes fundamental economic sense for the Europeans to buy their gas from Russia. Whenever the market is allowed to reassert itself, as it has been doing over the last few weeks, it pulls the Europeans back to Russia as the main gas supplier and producer. It requires constant efforts of political will, of political decision making from European officials and European political leaders to keep the arrow pointing towards the United States, whose supplies of liquefied natural gas are so much more expensive than the pipeline gas that Russia previously supplied. As I said, this month, that 1 month when Russia overtook America as a European gas supplier, it tells you, it points you to the hard kernel of fact. But Europeans, and by the way to a great extent Americans too, simply remain in denial about these facts. They remain in denial about the energy markets, the way shipping works. We've seen this with the oil price cap idea, the way trade between countries function, the actual effect of sanctions, the actual effect of seizing assets and floating loans upon them, the inabilities to keep the other side supplied with weapons, and the realities on the actual battlefields. People in Europe are beginning to understand all of these things. This is why we saw the results in the European Parliament elections that we have seen. President Macron of France apparently thought that it was a stroke of genius on his part to call elections when he did. There's an extraordinary photograph circulating of the French cabinet all listening to Macron, watching and listening to Macron as he tells them that he's made the decision to call elections. And the look of anger and astonishment on all their faces is there for everyone to see. The election has thrown France, by the way, into total chaos. The centre-right party, Les Républicains, who, by the way, falsely claim to be the inheritors of de Gaulle's mantle, they have no idea what policies de Gaulle himself actually stood for. Just saying. But anyway, Les Républicains are now in crisis. Its leader, the leader of the party, wanted to agree an electoral pact with Le Pen, whose party looks likely to win the election. Several of his MPs, in fact the parliamentary faction, then claimed that they'd ousted him from the leadership. He rejected that outright and barricaded himself in the headquarters of the Les Républicains. Then a court decision annulled the previous decision to oust him as leader of Les Républicains, which begs the question of whether Les Républicains even exist as a political force anymore, or who is their leader, or what is really happening with that party, which looks set to implode. And the left-wing parties, they said they would set up a popular front because they can't go into alliance with Macron, but they can't accept a victory by Le Pen and her party, so they hurriedly set up a popular front, or as they called it, but this brought together parties which are pro the Ukraine war, anti the Ukraine war, parties that support Israel, parties that support the Palestinians, parties that want a more dirigiste, interventionist economic policy against others which tilt towards a more laissez-faire type policy. This popular front, as it is called, already seems to be cracking apart just hours after it was announced. So again, it looks as if Macron completely miscalculating the situation, failing to understand the political realities in France or the true sentiments of the European public. He's now looking at a political crisis in France in a few weeks, with a possible sweep by the Le Pen's party, which clearly he has no real plan for, far from Macron acting to some kind of cunning strategy. It looks as if this was never really properly thought through. So, chaos, disorganization, detachment from reality, a refusal to look at economic facts, wishful thinking, and incredible levels of aggressiveness. All at a time when the Russians have offered everybody a potential way out, including the Ukrainians, and where they look like they're completing their plans for whatever big offensive is coming, and at a time when the BRICS themselves, of course, are moving forward towards their plans for a currency and trading system, which, along with another wave of expansion, they're preparing apparently to agree at their next summit in Russia, in Kazan. Well, sooner or later, reality will indeed finally dawn. How much damage will be done before then, I have no idea. But it looks as if we are trapped in this world of alternative reality, of structuralist narrative construction and wishful thinking, which appears to have those people who call themselves our leaders firmly in its grip. This is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can check out all our various programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. You can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Don't forget to check out our shop, where we have a new range of products, Football 24 products that you can also buy. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.